The Nile, secret of movement, a darkness in daylight, bringer of life to the people of Egypt. Long before the first pharaohs signaled the start of their civilization by building wondrous monuments along these black shores, the Nile flowed freely here. It was the source of life for small bands of wanderers who lived along these fertile banks. Fish and fowl were abundant, and there were crocodiles and hippopotamuses to hunt. Each spring, the river would flood, depositing a layer of rich, dark mud from which wild barley grew. These prehistoric people of the Nile harvested their bounty with stone blades and arrowheads. Life here was so dependent on the river that the Greek historian Herodotus would later call Egypt the gift of the Nile and the temple of the world. Scratch upon a rock on these cliffs or deserts of the Nile Valley, and the mark is left forever. Into this land, 3,000 years before Christ, would be the central figures of ancient Egyptian civilization, the pharaohs. From the beginning, the land along the Nile was divided naturally into two regions. The narrow river valley that extended northward from the African continent was called Upper Egypt. The lush delta region where the branches of the Nile empty into the Mediterranean Sea was called Lower Egypt. Joined together, this would become the Egypt of history. In this narrow valley, the monuments were built, the inscriptions written, and a mysterious religion and philosophy developed. This valley of the Nile, protected by the deserts which close it in, is the land of the pharaohs. The word pharaoh means simply great house, and it was the mission of the pharaohs to establish their spiritual and political supremacy over all that lived in the land. The foremost symbol of this kingship was the crown. One of the two most important was the white crown, a tall, slender headdress with a rounded top. It signified its wearer as the ruler of Upper Egypt. The red crown signified the ruler of Lower Egypt. When the two were combined and worn at once, the crown signified the pharaoh of all Egypt. The pharaoh also carried ceremonial tools called the crook and the flail. It is believed that the crook was shaped after a shepherd's staff and characterized the pharaoh as a shepherd of his people. The flail was symbolic of both a weapon and a tool for threshing wheat. When crossed across the pharaoh's chest, they signified his power to lead, protect, and provide for his people. Nearly every aspect of ancient Egyptian life was believed to be controlled by gods. Often the god was represented by an animal, a reflection of the awe with which these Nile dwellers regarded the creatures that shared their fertile homeland. The ruling pharaoh was believed to be the embodiment of the hawk-headed god, Horus, ruler of the sky and lord of heaven. Above all, the ancient Egyptians believed their life on earth and the order of the universe was controlled by a force they called Ma'at.
Pharaoh's job description might be described as maintaining Ma'at. Everything must function according to Ma'at, or the universe, the ordered universe, might collapse into chaos.
Egyptian civilization began when Upper and Lower Egypt were brought together under one warrior king in the year 3150 BC. He is believed to have conquered his enemy in a fertile field of papyrus to become the first pharaoh of Egypt. The physical evidence for this comes from Upper Egypt in the city of Heracleopolis, along the west bank of the Nile. Excavations have revealed a monumental piece of dark green slate, the Narmer palette. It is the earliest historical record of Egypt and was carved 3,000 years before Christ.
This is a replica of the Narmer palette, about third scale, so the original would have been much larger than this. The classical interpretation of the Narmer palette has been that this pharaoh, Narmer, was the king who unified the country, and this document has really played a major role in that interpretation.
Hieroglyphs of the pharaoh's name depict a catfish above a chisel and form the word Narmer, a name that translates literally as angry catfish.
This may sound to us rather amusing. However, the Nile has several species of electrically charged catfish that are capable of inflicting a very painful electrical jolt. So that I think the name really has some resonance.
According to legend, Narmer burned the enemy village and killed each of its soldiers. The reverse side of the Narmer palette depicts such a scene after the pharaoh's battle.
In front of the king and the followers of Horus is the remains of a battlefield with rows of beheaded individuals with their heads between their legs.
Narmer began a bloodline that marked the rise of the first dynasty of pharaohs over 5,000 years ago. 29 such dynasties, or distinct family lines of rulers, would follow. The changes due to either lack of an heir or by the wars and political infighting that lay in the future of the pharaohs, a period that would span some 3 millennia. In order to secure his conquest, the pharaoh Narmer probably married a princess of northern origin. He then moved north along the Nile and founded his residence city at a site known as White Walls. Here, in 3050 BC, he was succeeded to the throne by his son, whose name, found on a simple shard of pottery, meant fighting hawk. He was the pharaoh Hor-Aha. Hor-Aha's greatest achievement was the founding of the city of Memphis on the site of what had been his father's residence, White Walls. This city would grow into the political and religious capital of ancient Egypt. Made of mud and wood, it has all but vanished. But the Greek historian Manetho leaves an impression of this city of white walls.
Memphis was by far the largest city I had ever seen. A colossal wall of pearly limestone encloses the city proper. Within the wall, many temples rise from the enormous spread of brown brick houses, and around them tower an army of gigantic statues.
The pharaoh and his family lived in a palace inside the Great White Wall. The interior was brightly painted with scenes of Egyptian life. The wood-beam ceilings were supported by massive columns of stone. The pharaoh's morning began with a ritual bath that was witnessed by members of his court and his attendants. Because he was required to appear before his people dressed as a god, hygiene and appearance consumed a great deal of King Hor-Aha's time. During this period in Memphis, the hippopotamus was a prevailing symbol in Egyptian culture. Hunting them, in fact, was considered a great sport of the nobles and pharaohs like Hor-Aha, who pursued them in the marshes along the swamps at the edge of the Nile. It was on such a hunt that Egypt would see its pharaoh, Hor-Aha, killed at the age of 62. According to the legend told by an ancient priest, Hor-Aha was carried away from his people in the jaws of a hippopotamus. But did the pharaoh Hor-Aha really die this way?
The hippopotamus also has a religious implication, because the male hippopotamus was the embodiment of the god of evil, called Seth or Set, S-E-T-H. And one wonders, with this story preserved by a priest, whether it's a reflection somehow of the king being carried away by the embodiment of evil.
Perhaps the 62-year-old pharaoh really was carried away by old age, and the ancients attributed his death to their god Seth, the bringer of fierce storms of the desert, whom the Egyptians sought to appease. We may never know how the pharaoh Huraha really died, but we can visit his tomb in search of clues at an ancient burial ground on the edge of the desert. The city of Abydos was begun as a burial site by the earliest pharaohs to honor the god Osiris, Lord of the Dead. It was the legendary rebirth of his body that gave rise to the ancient Egyptian belief in life after death. 40 feet below the desert's surface is what remains of the Osirion, the temple at Abydos where the ancient Egyptians worshipped the god Osiris as a symbol of resurrection. Its walls are inscribed with chapters from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a set of instructions designed to enable the deceased to safely pass through to the next world. Until now, most bodies had been simply buried in a shallow pit. The natural drying effects of the desert sand against the corpse resulted in a withered human form in a very short time. To shield their earthly remains for all eternity, the pharaohs of the first dynasty built sturdy tombs here. Once buried at Abydos, the pharaohs believed they would join their god in the afterlife, and indeed continue to rule and keep order in the universe forever. The tomb that awaited the pharaoh at Abydos was called a mastaba, the Egyptian word for bench. Made to endure forever, the mastaba was built of sun-baked mud bricks with a flat roof and sloping sides. Inside were compartments stocked with an array of food, tools, and furniture, intended to fortify the king for eternity. Under this structure was a shaft that led to an underground chamber lined with brick. There the pharaoh's body would rest, and the shaft would be filled with stone to make the tomb inaccessible. Most scholars agree that the ruins of this tomb, which archaeologists call Tomb B19, once held the remains of the pharaoh Huraha. Around him were the burial pits of his faithful servants, concubines, and even pet dogs, who were all sacrificed and expected to accompany him into the afterlife. In time, such sacrifices ceased, and burial near the pharaoh was reserved for royal family and valued subjects. Another tomb close by was labeled with the name Bener-Ib, which translates literally to sweet heart. It is possible that this was the tomb of Huraha's queen, or possibly his favorite concubine. The death of the pharaoh Huraha marked the start of a period of growth and prosperity for Egyptian civilization that would last for more than 800 years. Memphis was the hub of culture and trade. Workers unloaded cargoes of livestock and vegetables that came from Upper Egypt. Gold, ivory, and precious stones were brought up from Nubia in the south. The Egyptians preserved some scenes of this ancient life in wooden models. From these, we know that barley was ground and kneaded into dough for large quantities of bread. Cows were slaughtered for meat, the preferred food of the noble class. A powerful country needed administration. These tasks fell to a special class of ancient Egyptian, the scribes.
The scribes are very important because they really represent the official class, the bureaucrats who make up the government, who really made Egyptian culture possible.